Good morning. It's News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. Today is, what is today? It's Wednesday.
Wednesday the 18th.
It's April 18th, 2018. And I have two guests with me this morning. Enrique Gomez, president of the Jackson County NAACP. Dr. Enrique Gomez and Marsha Lee Baker.
Dr. Marsha Lee Baker.
Are you really?
I am, really.
Yeah, you're a doctor? I didn't realize that.
I can tell.
What are you a doctor in?
I have a doctor of philosophy. My area is rhetoric and composition studies.
Well, forgive me for not knowing that. Dr. Marsha Lee Baker as well, who is the head of the Political Action Committee of the Jackson County branch of the NAACP. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about greening up the mountains and what NAACP has planned for that event and what the NAACP is doing in general these days. So what are our plans for greening up the mountains?
Our plans are to have a booth. We have a booth, and I found out just this morning that we are on Railroad Drive, I believe it's called, Railroad next to Back Street, all the local terms, and we're booth E14.
Okay.
And when I sent in the application for our NAACP booth, I said, branch members will distribute info on current ways to clean our human environment with love. And so we're persisting in that, although what will actually be in the booth, I have to tell you, Avram will probably know that Saturday morning. That we will have giveaways and information for, especially trying to draw in young people, you know, from kids on up to teens in college, and part of our NAACP efforts statewide. We will have two different opportunities to sign yourself up. We will have, of course, membership forms to join the local branch of NAACP, and we will also have voter registration. The third thing we'll have information on, and maybe handouts, will be the Poor People's Campaign, which is in my mind, and I think literally, the Poor People's Campaign, North Carolina, NAACP, and our branch are becoming more and more connected in what we believe and how we're going to act on it.
The Poor People's Campaign is taking off nationwide. This is a campaign that was started by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. back in 1968, shortly before his assassination. Can you tell us, Enrique, what has been going on nationwide now with Poor People's Campaign?
Yes, so the Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Renewal, Moral Revival, excuse me. That is, it's not an organization, but it's sort of like a coordinated campaign with multiple organizations essentially coming together. And this is essentially bringing back the work that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was working on when he was assassinated now 50 years ago. And that is essentially to bring into focus the moral bankruptcy of the nation, especially when it comes to poor people, extreme poverty in this country, and also to develop leadership within impacted communities, communities that experience poverty, so as to respond to that. So the Reverend Dr., now Bishop William Barber II, along with Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, they have worked together the last few years to essentially bring it back, and now it is, you know, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And there the focus has to be primarily on what has happened 50 years since the original campaign. And what is significant in the past couple of weeks is that last week they released an audit of the nation when it comes to essentially poverty. How is it that the country is treating the poorest of the poor and even people who experience mild poverty? and they issued some key findings. And truth be told, at this moment, I have not gone through the report. I've gone through the executive summary. But the reason why this report, and by the way, if any of your viewers wants to read it, it is available under poorpeoplescampaign.org, and then you look under the menu for audit. And the title of the audit is The Souls of Poor Folks. And essentially, it's breaks it up into various areas, not just poverty, but also racism, the war economy, environmental impacts, and all of that. And some key findings are such, and that is that as of 2016, there were 40 million Americans that lived below the federal poverty level. But in addition to that, if you have a much more expansive definition of poverty, you'll see that there are up to 140 million Americans who do not have, for instance, the assets needed in order, for instance, to withstand a major emergency. Like, many of them will not have $400 in their bank for any emergency in short order. You would have, for instance, one medical condition, and if you either don't have health coverage or adequate health coverage, you essentially can go into bankruptcy. So all of these things paint a very, very dire picture of how we're treating that, and essentially it is a moral outrage. And the purpose behind the campaign is that to point out that while we are consumed by, say, sexual scandals at the level of the presidency, while we are consumed by corruption or stories about foreign intervention in our elections, as outrageous and astounding as they are, they pale in comparison to the scale of human suffering that this country is experiencing. And the thing about this is that these are things that are not adequately talked about in the media. They are not the subjects of political campaigns. They are not something that are part of everyday conversation, but they should, because so many of us know someone that has been impacted by that. So we're coming up to 40 days of direct action. The Poor People's Campaign will start having a series of actions that will involve civil disobedience across the country, essentially to bring this piece of information for the fact. This audit that has just been released will give a lot of empirical data for us on the ground to bring the scale of the problem, to bring in some perspective so that people understand what is it that we're working with.
And I guess it has to be noted that this is all happening in the midst of the greatest period of abundance in the history of the world. And we live in the wealthiest country in the world. More wealth has been generated by the current economy than ever before, but yet such a large portion of the population is being left out.
It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say the most wealth and the most poverty both exist, certainly in our country. And I think that looking at Jackson County is a great illustration of that split. And that's why something as seemingly small or fun, say as having a booth at Greening Up the Mountains, can make a difference to bring this kind of information to the local level and share it. So we'll have some of that information at the booth also.
And that's, an interesting conflagration of things that are happening. Greening Up the Mountains is a huge street festival. I think each year somewhere in the neighborhood between 5,000 and 10,000 people come to this little one-street town in Silva, North Carolina, and behold the mountains. And I have to tell you, I was on the committee that first started Greening Up the Mountains back in 1996, I believe it was.
Thank you for that.
It started out as an Earth Day festival. For 3 years it was called the Earth Day Festival, and then the Chamber of Commerce approached. I was the chairman of the Western North Carolina Alliance chapter in Jackson County at that time, and we're the ones who started the Earth Day Festival. And then the Chamber of Commerce approached us about making it into a broader street festival, and the other group was Amy Garza and what's that called? Something of Appalachia.
Spirit of Appalachia?
Spirit of Appalachia, maybe. Anyway, and the three organizations got together and started greening up the mountains. And I have to express a certain disappointment that it kind of faded away from Earth Day and became more of a commercial street festival, and the standards went down in terms of taking care of recycling and environmental, and stuff like that. But it's great to see now the inclusion of the NAACP and other groups that maybe bring it back to one of social consciousness and getting the public involved in issues that normally are not talked about on mainstream media, with the exception of mainstream TV, of course. But no, it's really it's heartening to see that, and the Jackson County NAACP has been very, very active in the community. We've been in the headlines in the local newspapers, and I think we are raising the consciousness, particularly on race issues and issues of poverty, in a way that has just not been talked about before. And great credit to Enrique and to you.
Okay. Very kind. Thank you so much.
And to the others who have been involved in the NAACP. But yeah, and I hope that people will come out and look at that. So what are some of the activities that we have planned for that day? And you mentioned voter registration. Talk, if you will, please talk a little bit about why that's so important at this moment in time.
Well, several reasons. Beyond just the sort of the general, it's important to vote, take advantage of your right, all of that. It's an important time for every citizen to realize that he or she has a voice and needs to and can speak up about what he or she thinks is most important to our community, to our county, to our state, and on up the broader ladder to nation and globe. So we have so many issues locally regarding education, the environment, opioid addiction, and on all the horror that goes with that. We have several local elections, and then we will have elections that either in the primary or in the fall that will actually send representatives to Raleigh or to the Washington, our state and national capitals. And I think when a person decides to vote, they decide, I'm not going to sit back and act like I don't matter. They sort of own their own voice and power. And so it's important issues that have local relevance, and it's another way of bringing together community, where we have to talk about what we value, what we believe in, where we differ, which are very difficult conversations to have these days. Many people shy away from it. They don't want to have a fuss. They know they're not going to change their minds, and
there's an interesting. So the NAACP is a nonprofit organization, and we are nonpartisan.
yes.
And I think there's a misconception about what that means. Nonpartisan doesn't mean non-political.
True. And yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just that's an important distinction that I tried to make through my years in education. That to be political does not mean to be a partisan politician. And I don't know, Enrique, with your experience with Western Carolina students in your field, I had many students in writing and rhetoric where a primary activity was to sit and talk and then write and read about issues of concern.
Right.
And students were surprised that it was hard to come up with an issue that didn't have a political connection or ramification or cause or effect. And I would have some students say, Well, I don't really like politics. Well, I just really don't like politics, and I would say...
I'm not political.
Yeah, I'm not political. And I would say, well, that's okay. You don't have to like politics. But do you care about poverty? Do you care about sexual abuse? Do you care about, you know? And then so that, well, yeah. I said, well, let's look into that. And then it was a way of discovering how the political is not partisan politics, although it leads you to certain decisions as a voter.
We say the phrase that we have in the NAACP is that the NAACP doesn't have any permanent friends and it doesn't have any permanent enemies. What the NAACP has is permanent interests. So we have, for instance, our primary interest is the ending of racial discrimination. That includes, for instance, systemic racism. That is our permanent interest. We have become very interested, though, is the intersectionality of various experiences having to do with women's rights, the issues of minorities. Even we have become to be cognizant of the importance of building bridges in the white community, particularly people in rural poor communities that experience extreme poverty. And the reason why is because our analysis has shown that when you look at sort of the root causes of any of these issues, whether it be racism, whether it be sexism, whether it be discrimination, environmental impacts, all of that, and you trace back, you find the same structures, you see the same characters, you follow the money in the campaign trail, you see the same people over and over again making the same donations that impact people broadly. So it has become essential in an analysis to begin to build a very broad-based fusion movement that exists in intersectionality of all of these struggles, so that we can see our commonalities and we can show of attack the root cause, and so that we can become show of advocates for each other. So now in the NAACP in North Carolina, you have this phenomenon of urban black activists coming into the aid of primarily white rural communities when it comes to the closing of, say, rural hospitals and medical centers. Why? Because it's all impacting us all the time. You have to be aware not just of our own needs and struggles within our own communities, but also to see what's being impacted across other communities that we may not share an identity, but certainly we share an affinity of struggle.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The history of the NAACP bears out exactly what you were talking about in terms of being political but non-partisan and talking about issues. The NAACP was actually started by Republicans, as I understand it. There were many of the people who were initially involved in organizing the CP were affiliated with the Republican Party, and it was never strictly an African American organization. It was an organization that it was very inclusive. It included white people and black people and Jewish people and Christian people and it was a very inclusive organization and remains so today, obviously, by who's sitting here in this discussion. And in fact, Enrique is, I believe, the first Hispanic president of a branch of the NAACP, at least in North Carolina.
At least to my knowledge, yeah.
And maybe nationwide, as far as we know.
I have no idea yet.
But yeah, this since 2014 or 2013, there have been 6 new branches that have formed in the western part of the state, and they're mostly made up of white people. And you know, there just aren't that many African American people who live in the western part of the state. But there are both black and white that live here. And yeah, we're focused on issues and not on. We never endorse political candidates, for instance. But we can inform the public about how candidates from different parties or independents feel about the issue. And in fact, the statewide organization publishes every election. They publish a tabloid type
Election guide, yeah.
Voting guide that talks that shows all the candidates who are running for all the states, all the judges and everything, all the state positions and the judgeships, and talks about how they feel about different issues, how they voted in the past on different issues. Just a very informative stuff, and that's what we're about. Is I think educating the public about issues that aren't often talked about in the public, in the mainstream news media, but also advocating for those issues, not just educating people, about it, but advocating different positions on issues that are important to everybody, black and white, Native American, Hispanic people, and really all people.
This is one of the things, if I could add this as an example, this is for the first time ever I went to a state convention of NAACP. I went last fall to the North Carolina State Convention, and one of the many things I observed, listened to, saw in action was a recognition by the state leadership that there is a perception and certainly a reality that this part of NAACP has been essentially African American, essentially Christian, more like what I would say is in my growing up was a certain kind of Southern Baptist tradition, heterosexual. And what I saw in this convention last fall was a lot of public acknowledgement of how the NAACP is eager to grow and expand and be inclusive beyond let's look at our race and be inclusive. It's let's look at our gender, let's look at all religions. And I was hearing, to use one of my terms, the rhetoric change. I remember Reverend Spearman saying, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but I am learning and teaching myself how to not just speak about Christians or not just speak about heterosexuals. So it was this continuing unifying voice and action that was impressive and meaningful to me. And then to link it to Poor People's Campaign, when there's Martin Luther King Jr., as you said, in 67, 68, was understanding this is not anymore only about civil rights in our country. This is about human rights. And we have poor people that cut across all kinds of categories of people, however we might want to pigeonhole ourselves. And so that unity is coming forth in the Poor People's Campaign. And I think NAACP and myself as a member is very eager to advocate for that and help it happen.
I just want to point out, what you mentioned Reverend Spearman. Reverend Spearman is the new president of the North Carolina statewide NAACP, who's following the footsteps of Dr. Barber. And I really think the NAACP changed with Dr. Barber. I think it was his openness and his vision that opened up the NAACP to talking about gay rights, for instance. And we encountered, when we first started our organization in Jackson, Canada, we encountered among some of the, remember the district, I'm not going to mention names here, who were anti-gay, you know, and were very conservative in some ways, and reluctant to open up in that way. But I think Reverend Barber, his vision won out, and it greatly expanded the number of branches and active people in the state, and made us more influential in every way. The whole Moral Monday movement is an outgrowth of this grand coalition building in which we're recognizing that we don't have to agree with everybody about everything, but we all have of commonality in what we're fighting for and who we're fighting against to promote this unity and human rights, as you put it. But I think the Poor People's Campaign and Martin Luther King Jr. What his vision, how he expanded not only the NAACP but a whole also a grand coalition that he was building. It wasn't just about civil rights. He was saying it's about economic rights and equality, you know. And he was saying Martin Luther King Jr. was radical. You know, most people today's the way he's portrayed in the news media, it's almost like bringing Santa Claus back, or so. You know, it's really sort of dumbed down a lot. But what he was talking about was radical. I mean, radical change. He was saying, you know, when they were advocating for civil rights laws that provided the death penalty for lynching, for instance. You know, there were critics who were saying, "Oh, you're not going to change America overnight." The minds of Americans, you know, prejudice is so deeply rooted in the American mind. You say, "Well, that may be true, but if I can save people from being lynched, then
we'll work on that, and then we'll continue.
We'll work on
their minds and hearts.
In the meantime, we need this deterrent to prevent people from being lynched." And then, of course, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, because he was going to help the sanitation workers. He was helping a union that was getting stronger and gaining more strength. And then he joined the anti-war movement, and he brought that community together, which was a tremendous. And in 1968, this was the height of the Vietnam War, and there were so many issues that he brought together with civil rights, and they were all connected, obviously.
Well, one of the things that that you have, for instance, show of connecting back to show of the discussion of the importance of religion in the movement.
Yeah.
Reverend Barber is Bishop Barber now. He's very intentional, for instance, about bringing, recognizing that a movement needs multiple centers of moral authority. So when I've been in the stage with Reverend Barber, I share the stage with people who are rabbis, people who are Muslim clerics, people who are identified as pagan, people who are Unitarian Universalists, people who identify as humanists and atheists over there, and have them. The interesting move that you have there is that Bishop Barber has no qualms about claiming who he is and being transparent about that. You know, he is a Christian evangelical biblicist. You know, he puts it out there.
And I heard him describe himself as a democratic socialist as well.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, as well. But in terms of sort of the theology about that, there is a course that he helped develop along, I believe, with that Duke Theological, a course on sort of public theology, in the sense that we need to have people that have to be cognizant about their own faith traditions and to put sort of a moral analysis from various faith traditions on what we have here today. So, for instance, when we look at why is it that we cannot sort of people cannot muster the will to deal with poverty, the fact that people are not outraged that 1 out of 4 children at some point growing up will experience food insecurity. You know, that is an outrage, and you can see a long list, aside a whole list within Christian and Jewish scripture, essentially a denunciation about taking resources from the poor. You know, but when we talk about the presence of religion in the public sphere in theology, the focus then becomes on sexual behavior, sexual identity. The focus becomes on abortion. The focus becomes on whether we should have prayer in school. And then the question is why? Why there being such a scriptural basis for the denunciation of poverty and injustice? You cannot have the same folks mobilizing, you know, right alongside the Poor People's Campaign. And part of what's going on is that we are suffering from a very distorted moral narrative as to why people are poor. Why people are poor, meaning that it is your individual fault as a person
Like
if
you're
you
lazy
do not work
or
and
no
you
ambition,
with that
yeah.
and you have no ambition. So we have this distorted narrative. But if we have 40 million of our fellow Americans that live below the poverty level, if we have 1 in 10 North Carolinians that experience food insecurity, if we have 1 in 6 children, in the state experience food insecurity, 1 in 10, elderly out there periodically have to choose between either to get medication they need for their health or food or heating fuel costs, then we know that we're talking about something structural. So then we need to have a moral analysis to help us understand, how we have a responsibility to be our sister's keeper and brother's keeper, and actually mobilize these resources in our community. And it is really government, one of the tools that we have at our disposal to make manifest our moral expression and our willingness to take care of each other. But that seems to be absence about that. So it is an interesting push to begin to advocate or really invite people to look within their own faith traditions and join people from other Jain traditions to come up with a convergence of a moral analysis as what is it that we need. One of the things that we have in the NAACP, of course, is that we have for more than a century we have drawn from the ranks of clergy and lay leaders within black churches. And that has given a certain flavor to our moral discourse. It has shaped our presentation and our choice of prayers and so forth. And the thing about that you have to acknowledge is that really the black churches have really helped provide a language by which we can articulate people's suffering, not just through statements, but also through song and through worship and through prayer. And we shouldn't throw that away. What we need to do is sort of expand that, create a much richer, broader vocabulary, so we can draw all these multiple voices in. And I think that's an important part of it. So for us to be able to express ourselves, and every single member in the movement really should be able to speak with moral authority about any of these issues, when press forward.
Something interesting. We talk about how many people live below the poverty level. That in itself, the way it's defined in this country, is backward and really an ignorance of the reality of things. I believe that what's defined right now as below the poverty level is somebody who makes less than $11,800 a year. Nobody can live on that. And the poverty level hasn't been moved in, I think, 25 years, on the federal level. That's how it was defined, before the turn of the century, and that's the way it's still defined now.
And I don't see how, whatever approach a person is taking to that information, that just doesn't square any way you look at it.
No.
Economically, historically, politically, morally. How could that be? That has not changed. So.
Well, there's a willful ignorance about it. I don't think that anybody could sit across from me and justify that figure as the poverty level anymore. And so when we hear the figures like that 40% of the people are living below the poverty level, it's actually much worse than that.
And it's not. It makes the case that those people who live in poverty, or dire poverty, have not done all the things that they ought to and could do. It makes that notion even more unbelievable. Well, I'm just in my own daily experience, I don't walk around seeing people, left and right, just being negligent of themselves. And I see more people in my daily world who are really trying to make ends meet, who are trying to do the best they can, and it's not enough.
People who are working full-time jobs
Yeah.
and still living in poverty.
What about when I go to the grocery store and I only buy groceries for my husband and myself and whoever are guests in our home, and I look at families, children, hanging on to the grocery carts, and I just wonder how in the world are they doing it?
I do.
And they aren't doing it.
Well,
So
that's
we
just
don't.
people are getting further and
We have the
further in
empirical data,
debt.
great, but we look around,
Yeah.
look at our own, where we live.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is highlighted as a key finding in the audits that's also posted for folks in the Poor People's from the Poor People's Campaign this past week is that, since 1968, the average income accommodating or accounting for inflation has gone up 12%. But when you look at the productivity of the American worker, the productivity has gone up to like 73%. So the pay has not kept up with our increased ability to create wealth. And where's that money coming from? It is going up to people in the higher echelons of power. We're talking about a great concentration of wealth, a level of income inequality that at this point is now exceeding what we saw in the 1920s. The thing about this is that people would say that is needed in order for people, the captains of industry, to essentially mobilize and create even more wealth or something like that. Well,
Yeah.
the thing about this is that what people don't realize is that there's a tremendous amount of subsidies that goes up to that level. I mean, right now, you could essentially inherit $22 million and not have to pay anything on that money. Not only that, but even at that level, if you were to take, say a mortgage on a new home, you get to deduct the interest on that on your taxes, whatever taxes you may pay. So we're talking about tremendous amount of subsidies to a very narrow class of people that are not necessarily productive with those investments. These are people that essentially give money to especially the speculative part of the economy. People that essentially invest money in credit default swaps and derivatives and things that essentially are speculative instruments rather than wealth creation instruments. And there are no penalties for doing that. So in the meantime, for instance, we are talking about this week, as a matter of fact, the Trump administration has given an order for federal agencies to essentially review food assistance projects such as the SNAP program, and talking about increased requirements for you to stay in the program, like requirements that people have some kind of employment if they're able-bodied. Or requirements, say in Kentucky, that if you want to have any kind of Medicaid, that if you are able-bodied, you must get to work. The thing about this is that all of these orders come at a cost to the program of instituting a bureaucracy to essentially monitor people, their level of employment, adequate employment, and to determine whether people are able-bodied. So the moment that you do that, there essentially is no cost to the government. Any reduced cost to the government for running these programs. You're essentially moving money from people that would receive that money into a bureaucracy to start monitoring that. And that is possible. Why? Because you have this punitive model with regards to people who live in poverty. That essentially underscoring those arguments is that people are poor because of their choices, whereas our moral narrative that is being highlighted in this moral movement, the Poor People's Campaign, is that no, this is structural. People are in poverty because that is the structure of our educational system and criminal justice system. Our income and wage system. It is built up into our infrastructure. It is the way that we have structured our economy. So in order for us to effectively deal with it, we have to look at the structure of our society, of our economy, our political system, be able to denounce it and be able to analyze it. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign is doing currently.
And that's essentially the structure is that working people and poor people are subsidizing the wealthiest people in the country. If you're working at a substandard wage and you're living in poverty because of that, the person you're working for is getting all the benefit of the growth in the economy. And you're subsidizing them with your labor, with your cheap labor, you know, and that's what, you know, I mean, it gets to the point where it's even high profile, where Walmart is teaching its employees how to apply for food stamps and other government subsidies. That means the government, the taxpayer, is subsidizing Walmart. Why don't they just pay their workers enough so that they don't need food stamps, that they can afford health care, that they can afford to send their children to college, you know? And the government is government policy is based on the influence of these large corporations that are preventing it from giving us a living wage, you know, $15 an hour plus, you know, indexed to inflation or more. Actually, $15 an hour doesn't even bring us to par in real dollars with what people were making in the 1960s as a minimum wage. So if we were to even index to inflation what we're making this, as I understand it, in the 60s, a minimum wage would be about $22.50 right now. But we can't even get the minimum wage up to $15 an hour on the federal level, and it's because of the influence of these large corporations that are intent of exploiting the workforce, basically.
And in part, the most common reason for that I hear is, well, because they have to satisfy their stockholders. Well, now, y'all, I agree with everything y'all are saying, and we are really now at this moment preaching to the choir, at least of three people, right? And we understand this need and to change the larger system, the bigger structure of our country. And then, so it is the large corporations that concern us a lot when it comes to matters of poverty and certain aspects of government. Then how do we bring it back down to, from large corporation down to small community again? How do we look at Jackson County, Greening Up the Mountains, Silva Town Hall for the Poor People's Campaign? How do we continue to develop those voices and those initiatives?
Well,
you know, one of the things I am greatly concerned about is this ability, or a lack of willingness and ability, for people to, on a very local level, have conversation with one another. And from that lack of conversation and the kind of divisions that we've been talking about, you know, well, you're poor and I'm not as poor, and you're this color and I'm that color, and all of that, those kinds of false divisions keep us from having those conversations, and then not having the conversations keeps us sort of building those.
It's catch-22.
Yeah. So somehow we need to figure out ways to...
Well, I think we have to talk about issues that are important to everybody. I think economic issues are important to everybody. You know, I think whether you're white or black or Hispanic, and you're not getting paid enough, you know it.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's important to communicate the fact that, hey, you're not the only one that's having this problem.
Exactly.
You know, there's...
Oh, and it's not because you're just a lazy bum who won't do what
Right, it's
is
not because
necessary.
you're black.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's not because black people are stealing your jobs or Hispanic people are stealing your jobs. It's because you're not being paid what you should be paid. You know, I think we just have to, we're sort of trained to not say this in polite, you know, it's not polite to say this in mixed company. Well, we have to
blame each other, but only when we're talking to people who are like us.
Yeah.
Right? You know, so I don't want to come out and say, well, you know, anyway, I interrupted.
That's all right. No, I just think we have to summon the courage to talk about these issues.
Yes, it
even
is
though it's
courage.
considered taboo in some circles, we have to make sure that it's not taboo. We have to do things to make sure that it does show up in the newspaper. You know, we have to make sure that it shows that they're talking about it on the radio and they're talking about it on television. You know, and if they're not doing it, then we got to create our own television station and watch it. You know, and broadcast it. But that it all comes down to communication and getting the word out. Because right now there's such control over the mainstream media. Mainstream media is owned by 6 corporations, but almost the entire mainstream news media is owned by 6 corporations that are very powerful, and they only talk about certain things and they don't talk about other things. But we got to make sure we break through that barrier and let people see another perspective on reality and how and talk about the economic numbers and understand that you have to become active. You can't just allow others to make decisions for you. You have to get out there and be a proponent for yourself and for your neighbors. And you know, that's what I get so frustrated when I talk about these things. But you got to just keep talking about them.
Well, I mean, we could talk. I mean, just an example, perhaps, of maybe what we're talking about in terms of show of making locally. One issue that we're very deeply concerned here in Jackson County, Western North Carolina, Southern Appalachia, is the fact that we are essentially ground zero for the opioid crisis, and that based upon government estimates, that the healthcare costs alone of the opioid crisis since 2001 comes out to about $1 trillion. The healthcare cost alone. We're talking about the economic impact, and this is figures coming from the Trump administration as well. This is something that was just talked on the radio this morning. That in 2015, the economic impact loss of the opioid crisis in 2015 came out to about $500 billion. So this is in terms of reduced income, reduced quality of life of people. Just explain entirely upon the opioid crisis. So we are deeply mentioned. The thing about this is that I know several people that have been directly and indirectly impacted here locally in our community by the opioid crisis. So, but then this is where having a distorted moral narrative kind of hurts us, because the distorted moral analysis that says that people are addicted, it is their own moral failing. You know, for doing that. It is their fault. They should suffer the consequences for that. And if death from overdose, you know, we're talking about 40,000 people in this country dying of overdoses every year from opioids alone. If death from overdose is the punishment for that, then so be it. Thing about this is that we have to talk about what is going on. I mean, people are getting to opiates because the industry essentially paying doctors to essentially over-prescribe them. People are medicating themselves for health reasons as well as mental health issues that they may have. They're dealing with that. So we're talking about entire structure. And why is it that they have mental health issues that are untreated? Because this is not something that is covered through our healthcare system adequately, especially here in rural communities. We're talking about people who are depressed because they cannot move forward economically, that they don't see a way out, you know, that there's no solution to their economic woes, that they're not able to provide for themselves adequately. All of these things are essentially compounded. So the term that we use sometimes is called a syndemic. A syndemic is when you have multiple issues that are coming together to kind of amplify each other and make the problem even worse. So essentially what we have to do is that we have all this empirical data that we have gathered through the Poor People's Campaign. What we can do is that we can translate it specifically into our own reality, own circumstance, so that people can see themselves and each other in those numbers, so that solutions would emerge out of it and specific proposals that address our needs are going to be. So I think this is going to be the path forward. Yes, we can talk about the abstractions of national statistics, but it is the mark of an educated person to recognize or to be moved morally moved to action based upon statistics. And our job here as activists is essentially translate that into the reality of our friends and neighbors here in our community so that we can mobilize action through that.
Incidentally, I don't know if you're aware of it, but yesterday Bernie Sanders introduced a bill into the Senate that would penalize the pharmaceutical industry for the opioid crisis because of the advertising, that the misleading advertising campaign that they have been leading on, that doesn't educate people about the addictive nature of prescription drugs that they produce. And so far, not one other senator or House member has co-sponsored that legislation. Now that's something we should all write to our legislators about, I think, and
it should be the focus of the campaign. The 2018 is a midterm election.
Yeah.
We should be hearing from our representatives, Mark Meadows. We should be hearing from all of the Democratic candidates, Libertarian and Green, make statements as to where they stand with the opioid crisis and how they should actually approach the issue. We should be hearing from them on poverty and food insecurity. We should be hearing from healthcare. And so far, we are hearing essentially silence from many
and I mean,
people.
you hear so many politicians talk about the opioid crisis, but nobody actually has done anything to address it until now. And Bernie Sanders, the only senator that's not taking money from corporate interests. The pharmaceutical industry is the largest campaign contributor to. Across the board, nationwide, they're the largest contributors toward political campaigns. And Bernie Sanders and a few others are the only ones that are not taking money from the pharmaceutical. So he's the only one who's introduced the legislation, and which points to money in politics as being a root cause of the issue, of many issues right now. Our elected representatives are not representing us. They're representing the interests of the people who are contributing to their campaigns. And this is a huge issue. If we want democracy in this country, then we have to make our political system democratic. And I'm not, with a small d. Because it's Republicans and Democrats who are taking that money. And of course, the NAACP has been involved in that campaign too. They're a campaign partner in the North Carolina We the People campaign. Something else about the way money is distributed in this country that people need to be made aware of is when the whole trickle down economics.
Idea,
has been proven over and over again to not work. Obviously, it doesn't work because what happens is when the upper 0.1% gain money, they don't go out and spend that money because their wealth just accumulates and accumulates and gets bigger and bigger in the bank. They make more investments, but when working people get money, they spend it.
They have to.
They spend it, and that broadens the economy. It creates more jobs, and that's been proven over and over again. So when you raise the minimum wage, it helps everybody. It helps small businesses, and it broadens the economy and creates jobs.
When I've had this kind of conversation with friends, family, acquaintances who don't necessarily agree with what we're saying, one of the things I hear is, it's anybody's right to be rich. It's okay. If you can get rich, you can get rich. That's freedom in our country.
Right.
And one of the ways I've started to respond to that is to say, it might also be greed. And there are fewer people who will be able to say, I'm for greed. Be greedy if you want to. They will say, "I'm for freedom." Yeah, aren't you? You know. So it helps to put it in a, I guess, a more personal level, and in terms of one's own personal morality. If I don't think it's moral or right to be greedy, then I'm more able to have that conversation with people. And I want to back up. I caught myself a minute ago. You probably noticed I decided not to say something. But I do want to say about the opioid crisis and what politicians are saying or doing or not saying or doing. I have had the opportunity to hear 3 candidates who have been campaigning in Jackson County talk about the opioid crisis, and they have addressed it, and they have said, this is a concern, here's what I think is
You want to
causing
tell
it.
us who these people are?
No. I want to be really nonpartisan about
Well,
this.
you don't have to be endorsing them, but you can explain
Well, I have
how
heard-
candidates believe
I
the
have
issues.
heard in panel discussions that involved Philip Price, Scott Donaldson,
Steve Woodsmall.
Woodsmall. I get Donaldson and Woodsmall's first names mixed up, but I have heard them address that issue straight on.
That's true. They have.
Okay. Well, I mean, it is, for instance, yeah, I guess Marsha Lee, I'll stand corrected that it's been addressed. One thing, though, that we would like to see happen, for instance, is have a very concrete dollars and figures proposal as to how it's going to handle locally. So we're talking about proposal not just about penalizing big pharma, but also about providing paths within our communities, to people who have experience or suffering from opioid addiction to actually get the care that they need so it can do that. And the thing about this is that when you're in recovery, just having being a time limited, sort of medical intervention or treatment plan is not going to enough. We're talking about something that is going to essentially last years. So how do we provide recovery centers? How do we provide this long-term support? How do we find ways for people to have meaningful employment, and not have their addiction be kind of like a black box. Whatever interaction they have with that criminal justice system be a box that essentially would keep them from finding a path for enjoyment. We need to have a very extensive plan delineated to help people doing it. We need to have a local infrastructure. And right now, from what I've heard, whatever infrastructure we have in rural communities in Western North Carolina, they are stretched to the limit. We're stretched to the limit.
And for example, in Jackson County, we have no place for homeless people to live. There is no place. There have been at least 2 studies I know of more fairly recently to try to figure out a solution or solutions to that problem. But one of the roadblocks that I'm aware of is that whoever is involved in those discussions can't figure out how to handle the liability issue. And it seems to me at some point we need to be addressing the moral issue more than the liability issue.
You buy insurance to cover the liability issue. Well, at one
And
time,
I understand it's complicated. You can't you can't make a place for every homeless person to live together. You can't have drug addicts living in the same facility where victims of domestic violence are living, et cetera, or children. So I know it's complicated.
I guess there are some churches that take in some homeless people sometimes. But at one time, not long ago, they were talking about the old rescue squad here by Mark Watson Park being homeless. I don't know what happened that fell through. I know that there are concerns. Some of the members of the community have voiced concern, well, if we create a homeless shelter here, we're going to attract homeless people. And that this is a discussion that goes on in many communities. We don't want to become known as the center of homeless people, and that's what you have to battle, because until it becomes a universal value. Every town should have a homeless shelter. I think that should be a mandate like every town should have a school, you know, that everybody should accommodate homeless people in one way or another, and that way that concern won't be there that all the homeless people are going to come to your community. You know? But it's a terrible problem. I don't understand why there are homeless people in this country. I mean, in the wealthiest country
How can that be?
in the
How can we
history
allow that to
of
be?
the world. Yeah. Why do we have such a terrible homeless problem, especially at a time when supposedly the economy is booming and
Well, I mean, all it takes is, you know, a single bankruptcy from a major medical condition, and you lose your home and you lose your job, you know, and you lose your health care. That's all it takes, and so it becomes kind of like a structural.
But it seems like the moral failures of this country are bottomless. I mean, veterans. How do you have homeless veterans in this country? People who risk their lives for their country, you know, in war, and lost limbs, suffered all kinds of mental illness and stress. To abandon that population of people alone, I mean, to abandon anybody as far as I'm concerned, but that population in particular just points to there's something missing in the conscience of this country.
Thinking of the veterans here in our area, and this notion that we'll become a homeless shelter as a magnet for more homeless people.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the opposite in Jackson County, where one suggestion is let's just transfer all of the veterans in Jackson County to Asheville. They have more. Well, man, so that would be a magnet but Jackson County vets don't want to go anywhere else. Because a part of what feels the most safe for them, or doable, livable for them, means to stay here.
Sure.
And it seems like, I mean, that makes sense. You know, I mean, where you want to be, where you most feel you can live.
Yeah, well, we're getting down to some real issues, you know, and it's important, you know, that we have. I mean, again, I see a lot of studies out there that list all the problems that we have, and there are many problems related to poverty in this country. But what you don't see is any comprehensive plans to address that problem, you know, just because, we just don't have the money to, you know, we can spend $19 trillion in the war in Iraq, or whatever, you know, or whatever that costs, and you never hear anybody say, we can't afford to fight that war.
I am really weary of the argument that we can't afford it, whether that's at the county level or the national level.
Yeah.
It's a matter of prioritizing.
That's right.
And doing the kind of examination of the book, so to speak, that Enrique has described for us.
Yeah. You know, there are a few political leaders out there that are beginning to address the problems, but and you know, my area of hope is that these politicians and the issues that they're talking about are really resonating with the younger generation.
Yes.
And the younger generation is growing up, and pretty soon there's going to be more of them than there are of us, and things are going to change in this country. Maybe or maybe not in our lifetime, or in my lifetime.
They have seized the moment. They have something to say, and the moment is fresh, is here. In the same way that the time is now for the Poor People's Campaign.
Yes.
I want to make a connection to young people with our local branch of the NAACP, because some people are still learning that there is now a chapter at Western Carolina University for the NAACP, and our branch is looking for more and more ways to create connections, be coalition partners and supporters of one another. And I'll actually will do what I can in the next week and a half and try to gather information from the Western chapter to have available, because there's lots of teenagers and college students who travel through Greening Up the Mountains.
Yes. So what can we do to attract new young people, get more people? I think, you know, young people should be in the leadership of this, and sometimes I think, well, what we need to do is maybe just step aside.
I agree. Listen. We need to listen more.
We do. We need to listen more. But how can we get more people involved in the existing infrastructure of resistance, you might say, that's out there, or maybe we should just allow the young people to develop their own instruments of resistance, which I think that they are also doing to some degree.
And we go there.
And we go there.
Yeah. Like a little example, I mean, we know that we have marches every January to honor Martin Luther King Jr. And this year, our branch had members go to Western for the Western Carolinas March that was put together in part by their college chapter, but also by the fraternity of which Martin Luther King Jr. was a member. So
Alpha Phi Alpha?
Yeah. Alpha Phi Alpha. I don't know my Greek very well.
Yeah.
You know,
well, I
that's
think
little, but it's little. Be the snowflake.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting discussion. We've gone on for over an hour now.
Is that right? Okay.
Believe it or not, which is fine. But let's keep talking about it.
Could I do a little plug for our branch?
Please.
Okay, so our membership meetings is every third Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. We usually meet at Liberty Baptist Church in Silva, but sometimes we go to other venues as well. This coming April 21st, 10 a.m., we are going to have a meeting, and I believe it is at Liberty Baptist. We do have one special program as part. We do have a membership meeting, but then there's kind of like a program component in which people have had a chance to learn something or interact with people or have an open discussion. We were very glad to be able to support the work of a local teacher at a local charter school, Mountain Discovery in Bryson City, to purchase instructional materials, particularly books, so that students there at the middle grade level could actually have discussion and learn about the experience of race and racism in this country still. And we purchased one book by the title of Dear Martin. It's sort of a novel, but essentially it can be seen as kind of like an instructional tool to have people understand what it's like to be an African American growing up in the country today. So we are hoping to get to hear from the students themselves and the teacher about their own experience of what is it that they've learned, so that they can teach us people who are much older than them to see what their experience was, what is it that they learned, what their hopes and dreams, and what possibilities are there to do that. So I want to invite people to come and join us at Liberty Baptist at 10 a.m. This coming Saturday at 21st, and to join the NAACP. You know, we are a non-profit. We are supported through memberships. We have costs about $30 a month, $30 a year to be a member. You know, sometimes it feels nothing, but for $30 to be a member, your membership. So I invite us to join us in the movement.
That's great. And there's the Jackson County branch has a web page.
Yes.
And a Facebook page.
Yeah, that'll be. Oh gosh, I should know this.
I think.
Well,
as a matter of fact, it should be over there.
It'll be available at Greening Up the Mountains booth for NAACP. I always get it mixed up too. There's also a Facebook page. I think it's Jackson County. I'm not going to say it because I get it mixed up.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is either. Okay, yeah.
Clearly, we need to work on that.
Okay, well,
Jackson County NC
Is it
NAACP.
JC NAACP or?
That'll be, let me just tell you just a moment. Okay, yes. So it is jackson.ncnaacp.org, one word. jackson.ncnaacp.org.
And you can look up the Jackson County branch of the NAACP on Facebook.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Search for us,
As
and
well.
like us, and follow us.
And,
Enrique, I think it's okay if someone wants to come to the gathering this Saturday, if they are not able or don't want to participate in the membership meeting,
Yeah.
that from 10 to 11, they could show up at 11
Yeah, and
to
be
be
part of
able
the program
to
at 12,
listen to
yes.
the program
Yes,
by
absolutely.
the students.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So please do that
Yes.
and join us. And thank you, Enrique and Marsha Lee,
Thank
for
you.
Okay, thank
joining
you,
me
Avram.
this
Thank you,
morning.
Marsha Lee.
And we'll continue this conversation again, I hope.
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes.
All right,
Good.
great. Thank you so much.
Okay.